which has actually given Judith and I, my wife, a chance to return to Oslo. The last time we were here was in 1969. I think some things have changed since then. At the very beginning of my education, as I was about to move forward in my clinical career, and actually last year we were here also in Stavanger for a psychotherapy of schizophrenia conference. But it's good to be back to the city, and this morning spending time in the National Museum, etc., has just been delightful. So I also want to bring you greetings from Los Angeles, from Southern California. We've had a rather cool summer for us, but last week as we left, it was 35 degrees Celsius. So although we come from the land of the eternal sun, sometimes a thing can be too good, you know. And so it was nice to be able to leave that heat. That being the case, what I want to do today in these two lectures is I want to discuss with you certain of these recent ideas that have entered the field, partly my work and others, and you'll understand that although I'm a researcher, I'm really a clinician scientist, which means that I also have a clinical practice. I see patients, and that I'm always looking for the practical applications of these theories, etc. And I think that there are practical applications beyond psychology and beyond psychiatry. Much of my lecture is to the mental health field, but I want to suggest there are also cultural applications of this material. On Thursday of this week, I was presenting a similar lecture to this in the British Parliament, in the House of Commons, and in a room there of about 160, 180 judges, lawyers, barristers, politicians, newspaper people, essentially about the practical applications of this for broader childhood policy, in that case in Britain. And I'm somewhat aware of some of the conflicts here and some of the situations in your culture, and at the end of the lectures, if we have some time, I may give some thoughts about some of these matters also. But again, interested in the matters here of the applications, very specifically of this science. You're going to see that I'm going to use a lot of quotations, because what I want to do is I want to cite in real voice what the scientists are now saying and what the clinicians are now saying, because whatever kinds of conflicts there are about these matters within the sciences now, there is a consensus about the importance of early development, and also a consensus about this issue of the most important years of life are beginnings. And incidentally, notice in the title, the most important years, not year, although I'll be speaking a lot about the first year, actually the first 2 years here really are the key to this. So again, without any further ado, let's open up, let's begin here. And I want to start here with a quotation from the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, one of the major journals in the field, in an editorial, Developmental Neuroscience Comes of Age. These authors are now describing, again from the science, the phenomenal progress of the past 3 decades in the developmental neurosciences. Over the past decade, it has become abundantly clear that the dyadic relations, the mutual relations between the child and the caregivers within the first years of life can have direct and enduring effects on the child's brain development and behavior. When I first began to write about this 20 years, this was a proposal. It was a theory at this point in time. These ideas have now been accepted into the heart of science. And they go on to say that the enduring impact of early maternal care and the role of epigenetic modifications of the genome, that the genome can be affected by the social environment during critical periods in early brain development, in health, and in disease, is likely to be one of the most important discoveries in all of science that have major implications for our field. So the field itself now is seeing the critical nature of these new discoveries, etc. And again, the implications for our field, meaning for child psychology and child psychiatry. We now know that brain development is not just genetically encoded. That the development of the brain needs social experiences. So we're now talking about the experience-dependent maturation of the brain, and those kinds of experiences are clearly social and emotional experiences. Not necessarily cognitive, but social and emotional. So we're talking now about gene-environment interactions and how the relationship with the caregiver actually alters the genetic predispositions of the child, of the developing child's brain. It's not nurture or nature. For much of the last century, there were these struggles. Is this biological? Is this psychological, etc.? We're now realizing that Mother Nature and Mother Nurture combine to shape human nature. This has been really a move forward here in which these models now are integrating psychology and biology. And you heard John Bowlby, attachment theory. Essentially, his essential contribution was to say that if we're going to understand the attachment bond, we have to integrate both psychology and biology, and my work literally has been along these lines, the integrations of the both. And I'll talk quite a bit today about the integration of biology and psychology is leading us to new models. It is confirming some earlier ideas, and it is disconfirming other ideas, and I'll speak about this. So over these two lectures, I want to overview my ongoing work, and it's now 20 years and 4 books and 150, 200 whatever articles and chapters in developmental neuroscience and in attachment theory. And my work, again, is in brain development, especially in what is called affective neuroscience, which is emotional and social neuroscience, etc. So I'm going to overview these matters. But I want to suggest, especially to the professionals in the audience, that, again, you study this work. I have now 4 books. The latest book, The Science of the Art of Psychotherapy. The information in this field turns over very, very rapidly. The sciences are now turning over very rapidly. And in order to keep abreast of this, you can't really even look 5 years ago. So again, this matter of, of the changes in the field. But from those changes, etc., is coming forth this integrated view. And what I want to give also here is what we now know about the mind, the evolving brain of the baby, but also the evolving mind of the baby, and how the mind of the baby is being shaped by the mind of the mother, and how the brain of the baby is being shaped by the brain of the mother. So again, this is integrating developmental psychology and developmental neuroscience and into what's called an interpersonal neurobiological model of attachment. In 1996, I suggested that the self-organization of the developing brain occurs in the context of a relationship with another self, another brain. That as this baby is evolving, it is interacting with the brain of the primary caregiver, and it needs access to that brain, which, as we will see, it needs access to the mother's emotional brain, the social brain, much more than the cognitive brain, etc. It needs access, I'm going to suggest, to the right hemisphere, and I'm going to speak quite a bit today about the matter of the right hemisphere. And so in 2008, Judith here in the back, offered an article in which was entitled Modern Attachment Theory. Modern attachment theory meaning an updating of attachment theory in terms of the neurobiology of attachment. And we suggested that in line with Bowlby's fundamental goal of the integration of the psychological and the biological models of human development, which Per was referring to, the ethologists, etc. The current clinical and experimental focus on how affective, I'm going to use the word affective, same as emotional, bodily-based processes are non-consciously interactively regulated. Again, that the baby's emotional states are being regulated by the primary caregiver at levels beneath conscious awareness, has shifted attachment theory to a regulation theory. And the name of the first book, actually, Affect Regulation and the Origin of the Self, the Neurobiology of Emotional Development. Before 1994, we were looking mostly at cognitive development and Piaget, etc. The focus has now shifted into emotion. As you know, in psychiatry and psychology, it's now being spoken about the last 10 years, 20 years as the emotional revolution. We've moved from behavior to cognition to emotion. And emotion is by definition bodily based. So in the most recent book, I've suggested attachment theory, first created by John Bowlby over 50 years ago, is now revitalized, particularly by its deep connections with neuroscience. And I want to suggest at this point that I think that there are some misunderstandings of attachment theory, classical attachment theory, and I think much of the misunderstanding is not understanding the current form of the theory and how it has evolved as a result of the neuroscience. But I suggested that at this point in time, this was 2012, we have in attachment theory now a coherent theory of development, of human development, a powerful model of human development, especially social development and emotional development, that is grounded in both psychological science and in neuroscience, and thereby is on a much firmer ground than it used to be. So over the last 20 years, in this modern attachment theory that I have been offered, I've been attempting to describe how the social, emotional attachment experiences shape the developing brain, specifically the early developing right brain. And I'll speak quite a bit today about this right brain. The right brain has been called the social brain, has been called the emotional brain. The left is the linguistic brain. The left, in which language is there, etc. And as you'll see, language does not evolve in the toddler until well into the second year, etc. And most of what I'm going to be talking about today is occurring before language, pre-language, etc., into this right brain and the evolution of the right brain, which for the rest of the lifespan is dominant for processing emotions and for social connectedness with other human beings. So in the first part of this lecture, the first one will briefly discuss recent research on how optimal attachment experiences facilitate the experience-dependent maturation of this developing emotional brain, that the right brain needs emotional experiences from the caregivers in order to mature in optimal ways. And what I mean by that, actually, to alter the connectivity of that brain to more complexity. And again, that this development is allowing for the emergence of the core of the self system, and that the core of the self, literally, for the rest of the lifespan, is in this emotional right brain, etc. And thereby, these early experiences, these early attachment experiences are setting up the context that lays down the ability for emotional well-being in later stages of life, emotional well-being. And again, central to mental health is emotional well-being. Notice there is no such thing as cognitive well-being. So the secure attachment associated with emotional well-being. In the second lecture, I'm going to discuss recent neuroimaging of mother's love for the infant, which directly influences the development of the baby's right brain and thereby shapes that individual's capacity for all later adult forms of mutual love. Okay, so here we begin. The relational origins of emotional being. Notice the relational origin. There is now a move within psychology into this relational trend. as we speak. The Journal of Psychotherapy, which is the American Psychological Association Journal of Psychotherapy, now has an entire issue on the relationships between the therapist and the patient as being a central a vector of the mechanism of change of all psychotherapies. So everyone is now moving into emotions and into this matter of relationships. And here we're going to be talking about what Barry Brazelton, the pediatrician, the American pediatrician, called the first relationship, the relationship between the mother and the infant. And this is the cover of the first book. Notice the face-to-face connections, etc. Little advertising. So in the first paragraph of the first book 20 years ago, the first thing that I wrote on the developmental origins of emotional well-being. The understanding of early development is one of the fundamental objectives of science. The beginnings of living systems sets the stage for every aspect of an organism's internal and external functioning throughout the lifespan. In other words, all the functions of the body as well as the functions of the mind, the functions about how a person relates to the outside world as well as the internal world, everything depends upon these early beginnings. Events that occur during infancy, especially transactions with the social environment, are indelibly imprinted into the structures that are maturing in the first years of life. The child's first relationship, the one with the mother, acts as a template as it permanently molds the individual's capacity to enter into all later emotional relationships. These early experiences shape the development of a unique personality, its adaptive capacities, as well as its vulnerabilities to and resistances against particular forms of future pathologies. Indeed, these early experiences profoundly influence the emergent organization of an integrated system that is both stable and adaptable, and thereby the formation of the self. That the self, on the one hand, is stable, it has continuity to it, and yet it is capable of change. And an optimal self-system is capable of change as well as being grounded. So this is the cover of the fourth book, and much of the lectures today will be an update on the earlier models. At the very beginning of this book, this latest book I suggested, there is now agreement that the essential task of the first year of human life is the co-creation of a secure attachment bond of emotional communication between the infant and his or her primary caregiver. Notice the co-creation of the attachment bond. The mother does not create the bond. They are both co-creating the bond in a sphere of mutual influence. And again here, we're now thinking, and this is a shift from the past that used to be thought that the key to the first year was that the child would have more and more complex cognitions, more and more complex thought. We're now realizing it's this emotional bond really is what the first year is all about. The emphasis, therefore, has been on, you see this emotional communication. The ability not only to experience emotion, but to communicate emotion to other human beings. And in this first relationship, the baby is communicating its burgeoning positive emotional states. So we're interested now not just in negative states. It's communicating to the primary caregiver positive emotional states, joy, excitement, interest in play experiences. But the baby is also communicating to the mother negative emotional states, fear, anger, loss, separation, etc. Communicating these to the primary caregiver so that she can then accept these communications, feel these states, and then regulate these states for the infant. And I'll talk quite a bit about that. The attachment relationship in the end, however, shapes the ability to communicate not just with the mother, but then, as you'll see at a later point, with the father, and then ultimately with all other human beings, our ability to communicate with all other human beings. Now you'll notice this is occurring in the first year of life. The baby has no language, and there is a difference between language and communication. So here we're now, as you will see, very interested in this process of nonverbal communication. Verbal communication at a later point, and as you'll see, nonverbal communication goes on throughout the lifespan. So a little capsule here about infancy. Because in the end, even our conceptions of infancy has now changed rather radically, as we're looking at more than the behavior of the baby. From birth, an infant is plunged into a world of other human beings in which conversation, and you'll see this conversation again is nonverbal communication, gestures, faces are omnipresent during the infant's waking hours. Moreover, these harbingers of social information are dynamic, that is, they're changing in time. The baby's states are changing in time. They are multimodal, meaning that the baby is communicating through different sensory modalities. The mother is picking up the visual from the face. She's picking up through her auditory the baby's tone of voice and cry and laugh, etc. And the key here is reciprocal. These communications are going back and forth between the mother and the infant. And they're going back and forth at very high rates and at very fast processing speeds. These abilities to nonverbal communicate, again, these are rapid communications. So we're now seeing a paradigm shift in the conception of infancy. Because for a long time there was the thought that because the child didn't have words until the second year, that literally it didn't have states of consciousness, it didn't have a subjectivity, etc. We now know that this is not the case. First of all, from the very beginning, this infant is relating to the social environment. It is looking for these faces, it is looking for this body, etc. to communicate to, and at the very beginning it is ready to communicate. Again, the shift has been from cognitive development and thinking to emotional and social development. The baby is a sentient being. It's capable of perception. It's capable of sensation. It's capable of pain and pleasure. It's capable of emotion. And all of these capabilities are being shaped by this communication system with the mother and the attachment relationship. Without that optimal attachment relationship, there will be alterations in perception, sensation, and feelings. So what we're looking at here is the emergent subjectivity, the developing mind is created in this intersubjective context. And again, we're talking here about the early development of the human mind, especially for the psychoanalysts out here, the early development of the unconscious mind. So furthermore, as descriptions from infancy research, the infant's subjective perspective of herself as immersed in an all-social world against which she can interact with her caregivers, communicating with them, trying to make sense of what they do and their attempts to communicate with her. This baby has a meaning-making capacity that is being shaped by the attachment relationship. Notice all of this is happening without words. You used to think that all meaning-making must be through the left hemisphere and through the words. We realize this is not the case, that the emotions literally are forging the meaning. And again here, to communicate with her, acquiring the first elements of the cultural environment in which she happens to live. The older models was that the culture really does not immerse itself into the child until the child is old enough to use the words, and then the culture is putting the rules of the culture, again, through language at the third and the fourth year. But the culture is impacting the infant and the mother-infant dyad from the very beginning. The key here is that in order to process these dyadic, a dyad is a couple, these mutual communications, the infant is seeking proximity to the mother, but the proximity is more than just physical proximity. It's emotional proximity. It's subjective proximity, who must be subjectively perceived as, she must be perceived as predictable, that the baby now knows more or less that the mother is predictable, that when the baby cries or when the baby laughs or when the baby calls, etc., that the mother is more or less predictable, that she is consistent, that being key here, but also that she is emotionally available, not just cognitively available, but emotionally available. These are the necessary elements of the secure attachment. So in 1969, Bowlby suggested, when he was talking about the attachment bond of emotional communications, he was very specific about these matters. And he suggested that these communications that are going back and forth between the mother and the infant are accompanied by the strongest of feelings and emotions. So essentially what we're looking at here is an emotional bond, a bond of emotional communications. And he said very specifically that these communications are occurring with a context of facial expression, posture, and tone of voice. And in one of his very last writings in 1991, before he died, he suggested emotion is nonverbal communication of basic but very powerful attitudes in mind and potential action. And he said that in the future, what we have to be looking at in terms of the attachment is nonverbal communication. As you'll see, nonverbal communication is all in the realm of the right hemisphere. The left is verbal communication, the right nonverbal. And it's not just the experiences of emotions, but the communication of emotion. So in 1994, in my first book, I suggested, in line with Bowlby's ideas, that in episodes of right brain to right brain, visual facial, tactile gestural, tactile being touch and gesture, and auditory prosodic. The term prosody means the emotional tone of the voice. Again, many times it's the way we say something more than the linguistic content, really, that is important in our emotional relationships with others. The psychobiologically attuned primary caregiver, meaning that she is reading the baby's bodily states even more so than the mental states. She's not reading the behavior, she's reading the bodily states behind that. The primary caregiver is receptive to the infant's bodily-based nonverbal attachment communications. So here you see, and actually this is starting at 2 to 3 months. It's been called primary intersubjectivity. So you see on the one side, the baby attracted to the mother's voice, and the mother's voice now becomes an essential signal, but also attracted to the mother's face, and the hand expression, the gestures, replies playfully with affection, imitating and provoking imitations. So you see, from the mother's eyes to the baby's eyes, as they are reading each other's faces, and the baby is especially reading the mother's eyes. Even more than reading the lower parts of the face, the baby literally is focusing on the eyes, because the eyes really are going to communicate the necessary information. The autonomic nervous system is reflected through the activity of the eyes. On the other side, the mother watches and listens. Notice the mother is not doing anything. She is not teaching anything. She is watching the baby, and the baby is getting a sense that she is being watched, that someone literally is watching over her. The mother is watching and listening, and she's in a state, and these are, again, evolutionary mechanisms, that these are there not only for humans, but all mammals are communicating this way, face to face. The mother watches and listens, and she's listening again to the baby's vocalizations, anticipating the baby's expressions intuitively. And she's anticipating literally what the baby will send back to her next. And she's doing this through maternal intuition. We now know that maternal intuition actually is a right brain function. This is the ability to understand something without logically figuring it out. Intuition. In fact, there's now a lot of work on clinical intuition, the ability of a therapist in a moment to pick up an emotional state of the patient. So the mother replies sympathetically and playfully with motherese speech. That's the way we use the music of our voice to speak to babies, and actually it's the same way that we speak to pets and to our dogs, etc. And again, so she uses touches, and she uses faces and hand expression. And they're taking turns here, and the baby is learning now how to take turns communicating with another human being. And again, between themselves. These attachment emotional communications are between the infant's right brain and the mother's right brain. We now know that for the infant, the right hemisphere can be considered dominant in infancy for the type of visual and acoustic communication which is relevant to the pre-linguistic child. Again, pre-linguistic, this child is not coming to language. Broca's area, Wernicke's area, second year, we're talking much earlier than that. And again here, dominant in infancy. Actually, the right hemisphere is dominant in human beings until between ages 3 and 4. Then the usual left hemisphere dominance, language dominance comes online. But for the first 2-3 years, the baby is right brain dominant. And as far as the mother now, so the baby is communicating through its right brain, and as far as for the mother, all adults, we now know the neural substrates of the perceptions of voices, not the words, voices, faces, gestures, smells, pheromones, as evidenced by modern neuroimaging techniques, are characterized by a general right hemispheric functional asymmetry. In other words, when you're listening to your spouse, when you're listening to your child, when you're listening in any intimate relationship, we are reading the right brain cues of face, voice, and gesture, etc. at all time points in the intimate relationships, and the right hemisphere is dominant for that. And how well we do that depends upon what our early experiences were, right brain to right brain, with our own primary caregivers. So this is the face that I want to talk about that the mother is reacting and responding to, okay? I'm showing this for 2 reasons. First of all, this is a 6-month-old infant who is looking straight into the camera of her mother. And essentially, she is looking into the face of her mother. First of all, look at the face. This is the strongest positive stimulus that human beings respond to. Nature has set this up, that this face directs immediate attention, etc. And from the mother to this face here. You see the pupils, those large pupils? Those are Disney pupils. You look at any Disney, you'll see the large pupils, and they are a draw, etc. But the real reason why I'm showing this is because this is my granddaughter, Amanda. And rather than me passing the wallet around, so this is the face that nature has set up. And again, for all mothers, that face, whatever that face is the most beautiful face in the world. So on the matter of these, I said that they were right brain to right brain visual facial attachment communications, that the mother is reading the baby's face and vice versa. So now we have evidence about this. Grossman in Germany, 4-month-old infants who are presented images of a female face gazing directly ahead show enhanced gamma electrical activities over the right prefrontal areas. That as they are at 4 months looking at the face of a woman, you see prefrontal activation in the right hemisphere. And then at 5 months here, you see in Japan, Nakado, using near-infrared spectroscopy research, 5-month-old infants now, their right hemisphere becomes responsive to the images of an adult female face. Incidentally, there is more space in the brain for processing the face of a female than a male. So again, nature has set this system up. And again, here I'm going to show you at 2 months, which was before you saw the brain-to-brain. This is a PET study, positron emission tomography study of a 2-month-old infant who was looking at the image of a woman's face. Here you see this infant is now looking, and you see in red the activation side on the right side of the brain as this baby is looking at the face of a woman. Then I said the tone of the voice. So we similarly have now studies of this. In 1994, I was suggesting that they were the right brain to right brain prosodic. Here's the research now. It took about 10 or 15 years for the research methodologies to be accurate enough to confirm these. 2010, a study, an EEG study of auditory pitch processing in preterm infants born at 30 gestational weeks. Quote, these findings suggest that the earlier right structural maturation in fetal epochs seems to be paralleled by a right functional development, which means that even in utero before birth, the infant is processing sounds on the right side of the brain, which is why these older studies, there was some speculation that while the baby was in utero, it was responding to the lullaby that was being sung even before birth, etc. We now see that the right side of the brain is processing this material. There's also other studies showing that even at birth, infants will respond to music, which again, in the right hemisphere. So moving this along, at 2 to 6 day old neonates also showing acoustic modulations are lateralized to the right hemisphere. And I'm now going to show you at 3 months old, prosodic processing of the emotional tone of voice is observed by the right temporal parietal region, which is to say here, this baby, you see the right hemisphere activation in the posterior parts of the right hemisphere that process tone of voice, etc. This baby is asleep, and the mother is singing a lullaby, and the right hemisphere is being activated. And the circuits there, which are coming online, which are the synapses are forming, are now responding to that information. Right side of the brain. Remember, the left side is processing words, semantics, that is a year later. And then I said that they're communicating by touch. They're communicating tactile and gestural. So here you see in the infant child development, Nagy, a study of human neonates in the first 3 to 96 hours of life, and find a lateralized system for neonatal imitation. And even at the beginning, the baby is beginning to imitate the mouth gestures of the mother, etc. And the conclusion here, 2006, the early advantage of the right hemisphere, and here citing my work and Trevarthen's work, Schore in Paris, in the first few months of life may affect the lateralized appearance of the first imitative gestures. 2005, the work of Saratsky and Wohl in behavioral and brain sciences, now talking about touch in the right hemisphere. And for those of you psychologists, you remember the work of Harry Harlow on touch, etc., the centrality of touch, etc. With now the conclusion that the emotional impact of touch, the most basic and reciprocal mode of interaction, is also more direct and immediate if an infant is held to the left side of the body. I don't mean carried by, but I mean when the mother is soothing and calming. Evidence now showing that the left side of the body the touch is more direct in the baby's sensations. So here you see this is a Mary Cassatt, etc. Notice the linkages here as the baby literally, look at the gaze between the eyes here as they're reading each other's faces. Incidentally, the baby notices on the left side here, which gives the baby more of the possibilities here of right brain to right brain communication. Notice that the loops of their body as the mother now, you saw almost the whole circuit here as the mother is now touching the foot and the links there between the two minds. So these tactile, gestural touch, although the right hemisphere affect communication vector, left side cradling, facilitates the flow of auditory and visual communication between the mother and the infant, and channels the bodily-based emotional feedback. So what we have here is a feedback system. And the infant's sound to the mother's right hemisphere, which in turn tunes the melody of the voice, the mother's voice. She then now will change her voice as she begins to calm and soothe, or she'll change it when she begins to play. The lullaby will not sound the same, will not feel the same with the baby on the other side. And what I do not mean by this is that all mothers all of the time should hold the baby on the left. What I'm suggesting here is the capacity of the baby to have direct gaze into her eyes, the ability to literally have, at that level, the ability to process her tone of voice, and the ability literally to feel the mother's emotional presence in the body is the key here. The role, and so here the role of the right hemisphere is crucial in relation to the most precious needs of mothers and infants. In fact, we now have some evidence to show that if the mother is using her left hemisphere, if she's talking to the baby in a flat voice instead of motherese, etc., the way that we would speak to other adults, that and the baby does not have access to the right, if she is using her left hemisphere, if she is attempting to logically figure out what the baby needs rather than intuitively using her own body to read what the baby's body needs, that this may be less than optimal and could actually be one of the evolutions of insecure attachments. The baby needs access not to the mother's logical mind, but literally to her emotional being. So more about these tactile, gestural. This is the work of Tronick in Boston, observing left-sided gestures when the infant is stressed. That when the infant is stressed, it will use its left hand to comfort itself. That left hand being the right hemisphere. Remember that the left side of the body is controlled by the right brain and vice versa. Infants cope with the emotional distress caused by unresponsive mothers through self-regulation. In other words, if they're not getting the interactive regulation, they will auto-regulate themselves with greater activation of the right hemisphere during a stressful condition. There is a state-dependent activation of the right hemisphere because the right hemisphere is also dominant for processing stress. The right hemisphere is more involved in the social and biological functions regarding infant caregiver and emotional bonding. Schore, 2005, and my colleague Dan Siegel. Again, these ideas were put forth as proposals to be tested, but I'm going to suggest here that there is now a good deal of experimental validation of these ideas. So the mother not only receives the infant's right brain emotional communications, she's able to pick up the baby's pleasures and pains. She's able to pick up the baby in sadness, in joy, in excitement, etc., in anger, in protest. She can pick these communications up because she can literally feel them in her body, but then she can regulate them because the child now has little capacity to regulate, especially to regulate negative emotions. And here's where the mother is really an interactive regulator of the baby. And that essentially what attachment is the interactive regulation of emotion. In all intimate contexts, attachment, including with adults, the ability to go to others who comfort us, that interactive regulation of emotion, the ability to go to others to experience joy, to share that with other human beings. This is, again, the interactive regulation of emotion. The baby becomes securely attached to the psychobiologically attuned caregiver who minimizes negative affect, who down-regulates fear, who soothes and calms, and who maximizes positive affect, who upregulates joy in play experiences. And this has been a shift in attachment theory, because Bowlby essentially started out to say the reason for the attachment bond was that so that the mother could downregulate the fear state. But we now know that it is the upregulation of joy states, that positive emotional states are essential. And again, this has been one of the shifts. It's not just her ability to soothe and to calm, but also to play and to allow the child now to experience these positive emotions. So it's the emotional availability of the caregiver in intimacy. And again, we are talking about exquisite intimacy here between the mother and the infant, which seems to be the most central growth-promoting feature of the early rearing experiences. The Donald Winnicott, the pediatrician, psychoanalyst, one of the great champions of development of the last century, suggested that the main thing is the communication between the baby and the mother in terms of the anatomy and the physiology of live bodies. And so therefore, what I would suggest is attachment is more than just the ability to pick up the mental state of the baby. That again, the biology here is because literally they are regulating each other's biology. And the best iconic representation that we have of attachment now is this. So here you see the mother and the infant, again, communicating through the face, through the body here. And essentially what they are doing is that through the nature of their co-created relationship, the relationship that both of them are sharing, are now regulating their central nervous systems together. Not only that, they're co-regulating their autonomic nervous systems together as a result of the relationship. What I mean by that is that they are both now calming and soothing. Their heart rates are dropping at this point in time. Their cortisol levels are dropping at this point in time. Their oxytocin levels, quote, the love hormone, is being activated at this point in time. They are co-regulating each other's physiology. Not only that, they're co-regulating their cardiovascular systems together. They're also co-regulating their immune systems together. These are bodily-based processes by which the attachment mechanism is regulating the physiology of each, including, as I say, their brain states. So we now think that the language of the mother and the infant, again, is not verbal, it's not semantic. It's the language or the signals between their bodies, between the autonomic involuntary nervous systems in both parties. And there's a big movement now onto understanding the autonomic nervous system in the infant being influenced by the attachment relationship. The autonomic nervous system, again, the heart rate, the somatic aspects of emotions that are so key here. The autonomic nervous system develops postnatally, and it's being shaped by the attachment relationship. In fact, the right hemisphere is deeply connected into both arms of the autonomic nervous system. Go back to your biology, basic biology. The sympathetic nervous system, which was fight, flight. The sympathetic nervous system, which is energy expending, as well as the parasympathetic nervous system, which is energy conserving. So in calming, soothing states, the parasympathetic system is there to downregulate it. And again, both of these elements generate the somatic aspects of emotions. In essence, the right hemisphere, more so than the left hemisphere, is more closely in touch with emotion and with the body. The right brain is dominant, is more connected. So your heart rate is more controlled by the right side of the brain than left side. So from the neuroscience, this dyadic interaction between the newborn and the mother serves as a regulator of the developing individual's internal homeostasis, bodily states, the hormonal flows, etc. The regulatory function of the newborn-mother interaction may also be an essential promoter to ensure the normal development and maintenance of synaptic connections during the establishment of functional brain circuits. And here's the neurobiology piece, that not only is, not only are the body state being regulated, but also the actual brain development is being impacted by the attachment relationship. Now this baby, at let's say 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, etc., even before it is capable of mobility and seems, quote, to be doing nothing, and I'm suggesting here that actually it's always searching, always communicating, always interacting. But although it is not mobile, the amount of growth in the developing brain is remarkable. Here you see now an estimate that during prenatal and postnatal periods, the rate of synapse formation is estimated to be in the baby's brains 40,000 new synapses every second. So I said brain to brain. Now the brain on the other side here, the baby's brain, this brain, as you will see, is doubling in size in the first year. That these right brain to right brain attachment experiences are now impacting the maturation of the baby's developing brain. And so here the idea was, again, that the right hemisphere is dominant and is being shaped by these. In 1997, in the journal Brain, Schore in France, her laboratory authored an article, "The Right Brain Hemisphere is Dominant in Human Infants." Another study by Allan in the United States, "The strong and consistent predominance for the right hemisphere emerges postnatally, that the child learns now how to process these prosody of the mother's voice, gets even better at reading the emotional communications on her face, at reading tactile gestures, etc. And then the idea here about the earlier maturation of the right hemisphere is now supported by anatomical and imaging evidence. So again, all of this is now influencing the right hemisphere, which is in a growth spurt. The left hemisphere does not come into a growth spurt until about the middle of the second year. This is an fMRI study in Italy by Lenzi of the mother-infant emotional communications, offering data, quote, supporting the theory that the right hemisphere is more involved than the left hemisphere in emotional processing and thus mothering. And in Japan, 2009, Minagawa Kawai, in her laboratory, using near-infrared spectroscopy, a study of infant-mother attachment at 12 months. 12 months was the time when Bowlby was looking at the strange situation in Ainsworth. And they concluded, our results are in agreement with that of Schore, who addressed the importance of the right hemisphere in the attachment system. And that made my day. Again, I want to point out here that these ideas I'm suggesting now are accepted principles of human development, that they were set out as proposals to be tested, and now, especially if you're looking at the data over the last 5 years, you'll see that there is remarkable validations for these particular models. This is a journal, Neuroimage, and the reason why I'm saying Meany is because those of you who are aware of neuroscience will realize that Michael Meany, the Canadian, is probably the foremost experimental neuroscientist in the world. And so here they report that the human neonatal brain, even at 5 to 17 days, presents two well-organized hemispheres with very distinct and lateralized functions. And they conclude, in early life, the right cerebral hemisphere could be better able to process emotion. Again, citing my work, this idea appears consistent with our findings of a rightward asymmetry in limbic structures. The limbic system is the emotion processing system, and it is more elaborated on the right side of the brain. These neural substrates functions as hubs in the right hemisphere for emotion processes and mother and child interaction. Actually, I want to point out here that the two sides of the brain are not equal. The two sides of the brain are distinct functional systems. That is to say, they are not mirror images of the other. Each has a distinct neurophysiology, a distinct neurochemistry, a distinct neuroanatomy. These are two very different systems. And when we were just looking at motor behavior, left and right, etc., we didn't capture this. So we're not looking at two sides of one brain. We are looking at two different systems, the right and the left hemisphere, and that these operate independently. Yes, they can operate in concert with each other, but independently. And actually, they have separate growth spurts. They do not grow together. Actually, when you go to sleep, literally, the left hemisphere goes to sleep first and then the right hemisphere. So these ideas about the differences between the two hemispheres, which first came out in the 70s and then were thought to be rather controversial, this matter of brain laterality now is actually at the cutting edge of science. These are two very different functional systems. A later forming, logical, analytical, verbal in the left. Right now, my left is communicating to your left, my Broca's area to your Wernicke's area, and then this right system, which is dominant, as you will see, for survival functions. The left is dominant for language, the right is dominant for survival functions. And nature has it that these survival functions, these communication functions and the attachment, is what comes online first. So, my colleague Jennifer McIntosh, Australian research psychologist, we've written that studies now show that one parent is the primary organizer of the infant's stress states and in nucleus setups. This is usually the mother. Now, as you will see over the course of these 4 hours, what I'm going to be talking about here is a consensus in science that essentially the mother and the father are not equivalent systems, that they serve very different functions, that they are not replaceable, and that in the attachment relationship, the primary caregiver who is setting up the right brain is the mother. So again here, when it comes to stress states and the baby learning how to regulate stress, the mother is the one in the first year who is setting up the circuits in the attachment relationship that downregulate stress for the rest of the lifespan. The work of Megan Gunner in Minnesota, it's maternal care within the attachment relationship shapes the infant's stress-regulating hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortical axis. The HPA axis is the stress-regulating axis in human beings, the ability, again, to regulate stress, and most stress in human beings comes from relationships more than the physical environment. The ability to regulate stress is being shaped by the maternal care and the attachment relationship. And just for the record, we know that every major psychiatric disorder involves a dysregulation of stress and a dysregulation of emotion, etc. So here, it's this right hemisphere which regulates the stress-regulating HPA axis, and if the left, the later evolving left, is dominant for language, the right hemisphere is responsible for the control of vital functions supporting survival, enabling the organism to cope with stresses and challenges. Subsequent to the child's attachment to the mother in the first year, the baby forms another to the father at the end of the first and into the second year. And in 1994, I was suggesting this, which was also, there was earlier research to show that in the second year, you will see a full-blown separation response to the father in the second year as it would give to the infant in the first year. And so authors began to write that the biorhythmicity of man with infant and women with infant affords the infant to have interactive state sharing and state attuning experiences with two different kinds of caregivers. We've known for a long time that the mother's play, the mother's interactions with the baby are more soothing and calming, and that the fathers are more energetic, etc. So we're looking at two different types of caregivers. In my own work, I'm suggesting that the mother is involved with the baby, with setting up the systems in the baby's right brain, which regulate fear in the first year, but that in the second year, the father is critically involved in both male and female toddlers' ability to regulate aggression. Again, Braun's laboratory in Germany is now showing, and there were hardly any studies, but now we know that paternal care also affects synapse formation in the developing brain at a later time and also in later areas of the brain. In fact, in one of the only studies on the father's brain, a study here from Israel by Abraham, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, USA, earlier this year, title being Father's Brain is Sensitive to Child Care Experiences. And they study here the parental brain responses. Most of the studies have been on the mother. Here studying the parental brain responses to infant stimuli, in other words, the face of their own children, using functional magnetic resonance imaging using oxytocin and parent behavior. And they are measuring what they call primary caregiving mothers and secondary caregiving fathers. So that the idea that the mother is the primary caregiver and the father then the secondary caregiver, which actually has been a part of attachment theory for a long time, is now accepted by neuroscience. Women are better at reading faces than men. Women are also better at emotionally expressing their emotions on faces than men, which is why on many scales also women are higher in empathy than men. But that being the case, let me just suggest, we now have tentative evidence, but it appears that men do have right brains. So here, no press on that. So here, in this study, they're now describing a parenting caregiving system. And actually here they're using infants at 11 months. What fathers are doing with infants and toddlers at 11 months. Not 6 months and 3 months. I think that would be a different story. 11 months. And what they're finding is that there are two different brain systems. That there is a subcortical limbic meaning emotion, structures involved in emotional processing and cortical areas involved in social understanding. Let me say this again. The subcortical areas of the brain evolved before the cortical areas of the brain. The subcortical areas of the brain, I'm going to be talking about this, the amygdala. There's a lot of interest now in psychiatry and neuropsychiatry in the amygdala, the subcortical area of the brain. That the subcortical areas of the brain are involved with emotional processing and then the cortical with social. Mothers showed a greater activation in the emotion processing network and fathers more in the cognitive networks. So again, you're seeing the difference here on the influence of the father and the mother on different brain structures. The mother more emotionally, the father more cognitively. Both of these are necessary, yes, but essentially there are differences here. Primary caregiving mothers showed higher subcortical activation, secondary caregiving fathers greater activation in the cortical cognitive circuits. And they conclude. The incidentally, obviously you have the notes there. So again, use these and go back to these. And if at any point in time anyone wants the exact references, email me and I can give you the exact references. The phylogenetically ancient role of maternal care. In other words, this system that I have been talking about, this right brain to right brain system, which is found in all mammals, etc., This is a very ancient system, which has remained relatively uniform across time and culture. It appears to be underpinned by evolutionarily ancient structures, meaning the subcortical structures of the brain. Paternal care appears to be underpinned by later developing prefrontal temporal parietal circuits supporting social understanding. Maternal care has remained uniform. I'm going to suggest perhaps later that I think that the culture is now tampering with these ancient evolutionary structures. I may or may not talk about this, but in the United States, because we have no care, maternal care, nor paternal care, the only rich country in the world with such, many of our parents are handing the infants into daycare at 6 weeks. 6 weeks when these brain systems are beginning to evolve. The culture can either facilitate or inhibit these systems here. So here you're seeing the right hemisphere being in a growth spurt between 0 in the first year of life, as I said. Then you'll notice there's a swing, and the left hemisphere goes into a growth spurt somewhere about 1.5 years, 2 years. And then it comes back to the right hemisphere goes into a growth spurt, left, right, not quite as intense. So there is later plasticity in the system, but the major organization, again, of the right hemisphere early in the first year of life. Again, the key here is the human brain growth spurt. That is, the brain is in its most rapid, accelerated growth from the last trimester of pregnancy through the end of the second year. So from literally prenatally, from the last trimester of pregnancy through about 18 to 24 months is this massive growth spurt of the human brain. And during that time, the attachment relationship literally is shaping that growth. Again, which is why I said the most important years of life, not just the first year of life. In American pediatrics in the United States of America, they're talking about the critical importance of the first 1,000 days. 1,000. The first 270 days are the 9 months of pregnancy. We now know this is critical. Then the next 2 years would add 365. So the first 1,000 days brings you to about 24 months. That really is the essential period. And if cultures are going to protect the mother and the infant, and also the father and the infant, protect the attachment, for me, that is the span, that is the key. So again, the attachment is the source of right brain functions of emotional well-being over the lifespan. The left hemisphere is dominant for language behavior. For semantics, it's also dominant for motor behavior. But the right hemisphere is dominant for regulating stress and also for regulating all emotional functions. The ability to experience emotions, the ability to read nonverbal emotions in other human beings, etc., to communicate, etc. All emotional functions are being processed in the right, and all abilities to regulate stress in the right. Here's in a capsule, what the right does. And actually, this has a lot of meaning for psychotherapists. Mental states that are, in essence, private to the self, may be shared between individuals. Self-awareness, empathy, the ability to identify with others, and more generally, intersubjective processes, the ability to connect my mind with another mind, which is literally critical for intimacy, are all largely dependent upon right hemisphere resources, which are the first to develop, as I said. Other functions of the right brain, which is why psychiatry and psychotherapy and psychoanalysis are so interested in the right brain. The right hemisphere operates a distributed network for rapid responding to danger and other urgent problems. That the right hemisphere, much quicker than the left, can pick up danger, can pick up what is safe, what is dangerous. We look at another face at non-conscious levels. The right amygdala can detect safety and danger in 60 milliseconds. It takes 250 milliseconds, a quarter of a second, for something to come to consciousness. So these are very rapid processes by which we pick up safety, danger, familiar, unfamiliar, gender, etc. The right preferentially processes environmental challenge, stresses. And remember, stresses are part of human life, etc. Stress, pain. The right processes pain. And it also manages self-protective responses such as avoidance and escape. All of these are not functions of the conscious mind in the left hemisphere, but of the unconscious mind in the right brain. What's more, again, this is what the secure attachment is going to set up the right brain with these functions. The right hemisphere has a relative advantage over the left, mediating social intelligence. Now again, I'm not talking about left hemispheric intellectual abilities, verbal intelligence, social intelligence, which are, for the rest of their lifespan, and this is being influenced by the mother-infant relationship, the ability to identify social stimuli, meaning the ability to read faces, tones of voice, and gestures of other human beings. The understanding of the intentions of other people. The awareness of the dynamics in social relationships. And the successful handling of social interactions, which is why individuals who have right hemispheric deficits are unable to process intimate social relationships, which is why this child at 7 years old who cannot read faces and voices misattributes the intentions of other human beings, etc., and misinterprets their motives. All of these are being shaped by the right brain, especially in the first 2 years of life. Notice these are critical for the culture and for navigating through the culture. These models I have also put forth models of psychopathogenesis. If what we have talked about to this point is optimal early development and secure attachments, I have also talked about models of what happens when the systems go awry, etc. And I've suggested that interpersonal neurobiology, notice interpersonal neurobiology, brain-to-brain communications, the way that social relationships shape our brains throughout our lifespans, explains how early social emotional experience indelibly influences all later experiences by impacting and altering the developing brain. The emotional, relational environment provided by the primary caregiver shapes, for better or worse, the experience-dependent maturation of the brain systems evolved in attachment functions that are accessed throughout the lifespan. And as you remember, Bowlby said that we continuously activate the attachment mechanisms in internal working models of other human beings, which are really guiding our emotional relationship. They are acting beneath levels of conscious awareness, and these internal working models are being shaped up by the attachment relationships. And again, we can have secure relationships or we can have insecure attachment relationships. And my work has also been involved in the neurobiology of insecure attachment relationships, with the idea that these insecure attachment relationships also can be the foundation, the early foundation of emotional disorders and psychiatric disorders. I won't talk about this afternoon, but the worst possible beginnings, of course, would be abuse and neglect. And there's a lot of interest now in abuse and neglect in psychotherapists, individuals, children, and adults who have early histories of abuse and neglect, and how we can change these attachment relationships. So the idea is that the caregiver is shaping for better or for worse. The best current description of of the path of neurodevelopment is that the infant is malleable, not resilient. There was a problem for me that for many years, developmental psychology was putting out the idea that all children are resilient. This is not the case. And actually, what we're now finding out as the reason for that was that early on, when they were looking at early experiences which were clearly insecure attachment, and they were just looking at cognitive measures and language measures down the side, up to 2-3 years later, they weren't finding anything. But when they started to look at emotional and social functions, it was something else. So all infants are malleable. They are not resilient. Resilience is the outcome of a secure attachment. So here you see the vital task of establishing a personally relevant universe and the solace derived from it on right hemisphere depend on right hemispheric function. If this function is indeed lost in the insecurely attached, much has been lost. Translating that from the psychology into the biology, positive, or the formation of a positive emotional attachment, or negative, such as maternal separation or loss. And again, much of the attachment literature, as well as the attachment neuroscience, has focused on maternal separation or loss as being a much more important factor, not only in later emotional health, but also in emotional, lack of infant mental health. But either the positive or the negative emotional experiences may carve a permanent trace into a still developing neuronal network of immature synaptic connections, and thereby they can either extend or limit the functional capacity of the brain during later stages of life. But these are having more than just psychological effects, they are actually impacting the connectivity of the right brain per se, which I say is dominant for these survival functions. In the Journal of Neuroscience, 2008, Nick Meyer, the large increase in total brain volume in the first year of life, as I suggested, suggests that this is a critical period in which disruption of developmental processes as the result of an innate genetic abnormality or as a consequence of environmental insults, read environmental insults, meaning insecure attachments, meaning poorly regulated attachment functions, meaning the caregiver now not downregulating negative and upregulating positive, but dysregulating the baby and unable to repair the baby in dysregulated states, may have long-lasting or permanent effects on brain structure and function. Although the first year of life may be a period of developmental vulnerability, it may also be a period in which therapeutic interventions would have the greatest positive effect. And I mean by those not only mother-infant interventions and also paternal interventions, but also in terms of the culture. Can the culture protect the dyad here at the very beginning? We are looking here at a period of maximal brain plasticity as well as maximal brain vulnerability. So I've suggested in human infancy, these right brain functions are dominant and they need to be allowed to fully mature. Throughout life, the right and not left brain is centrally involved in critical survival functions. The allocation of attention. Attention, again, is dominant for the right. And certainly those of you who are thinking, is the etiology of attention deficit disorder here in the first year? Absolutely the case. And incidentally, there are a lot of studies to show right hemispheric dysfunction in ADHD. Right? But the right is also dominant for the capacity to experience positive and negative emotion, the ability to experience joy, excitement, the ability to also experience negative emotions. And let me just deliver a little piece on this matter of positive and negative emotions. The idea that positive emotions are good and negative emotions are bad is a fallacy. And actually, some in science actually have this. The ability to experience negative emotions is critical to the human experience. The ability to feel loss, to feel pain, is important to mourn and to grieve. The ability to experience shame also is experience. It's a moral emotion, etc. The ability to experience even fear. I mean, nature has put these motivational systems in place, and someone who cannot experience fear actually is in a very high danger level. We've got a fearless 12-year-old child, etc., who is attacking someone else. So negative emotions can be adaptive. Dysregulated negative emotions are not adaptive. And all positive emotions are not necessarily positive either. You have somebody in a manic state, etc. That's not. So again, here, it's not positive and negative. It's the ability to have access to all emotions. And the wider the ability for a person to experience emotions, the more emotionally healthy the self is. The ability to feel both the treble clef of joy as well as the sadness and the bass clef, etc. So the right is dominant for this. And in the end, emotional well-being is the key here. The regulation of stress, as I said, is not being done by a conscious mind. It's done by the right brain. The ability to empathically and intuitively read the emotional states of other human beings. And indeed, in the last 5 years, there is a lot of evidence now to show that indeed morality is a function more of the right hemisphere than the left. My colleague Russell Mears in Australia has said that this right hemisphere is dominant for this background state of well-being. Again, this generally positive state of well-being is being provided out of the attachment relationship. Infants and toddlers, first year, second year, have unique social emotional needs. What I mean by this is that the needs of an infant and a toddler are different than the needs of a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old. In fact, the brain of an infant and a toddler are qualitatively different than the brain of a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old, etc. You cannot use developmental psychology and child development and just automatically put that back into infants. They are, again, a very different being, and it was for this reason that our understanding of infancy took so much time through most of the last century until finally we had the science to be able to understand these emotional needs. Again, what we're looking at here is the critical role of infant mental health to later adult mental health and to emotional well-being, which is another way of saying the critical role of early secure attachment and the critical role of early right brain development to later emotional well-being. In 2001, in an introduction to a special issue of the Infant Mental Health Journal, I offered an article, Contributions from the Decade of the Brain to Infant Mental Health. And in 2001, I noticed the title of the journal, the Infant Mental Health Journal, in which I invited a number of neuroscientists who were writing on, and this was 13, 14 years ago, the result of the decade of the brain, again, to now what we know about infancy. And actually, this is still the most read journal issue of that journal. And looking ahead, I started to talk about the political implications of this new knowledge about infancy and right brains. And I suggested the earliest stages of humanhood are critical because they contain within them the representations of our possible futures. Again, these essentially are the future members of our societies, of our cultures. These earliest stages model the potential developmental extension of our individual and our collective identity? When and where shall we place our current resources so as to optimize the future of human societies? How much should we value the very beginnings of human life in tangible social program dollars? So I'm asking this in 2001. Now, just for the record, 2001 turned out to be quite a critical year in human civilization, of course. What happened in New York, et cetera, and the angst that has occurred from that point in time. But even so, it was pretty clear at that point in time that cultures were putting much more money into defense than they were into this matter of early human development. In 2013, UNICEF offered a report, Child Well-Being in Rich Countries. And in that, they evaluated child well-being in about 29 rich countries around the world. Norway came out number 2 of 29. That's quite remarkable. The United States came out 26 out of 29 on the bottom. Actually, Britain came out 25. And in 2006, Britain was, in 2006, Britain was 25, and then by 2013, Britain had moved up to number 16. So again, here's this rating here. And incidentally, the fact that the United States is on the bottom, I want to suggest to you, do not always look to the United States as to what is optimal and what should be done next. I mean, we're seeing this right now in terms of what's happening in the world and what happens again and again, and it appears that we have little ability to learn from our mistakes, and we're continuing to do the same thing over and over. So in this report, and I suggest those of you who are involved with the cultural aspects get your hands on this report, because it's very detailed, and it's very detailed about where Norway is advancing and the parts of where Norway still is behind, etc. But they suggested it is perhaps no longer necessary to argue the case for the importance of the early years. Advances in both neuroscience and social science have repeatedly confirmed that it is at this time that genetic potential interacts in infinitely complex ways with early experience. You see, at the beginning, I told you, we're now thinking epigenetic. It's not genetic. It's this biological and versus psychological. We're now seeing the interaction of the psychobiological here. The interaction of the emotional communications of the attachment relationship with the genes as they're spinning out in the brain. Because again, the truth of it is, the idea that everything before birth is genetic and everything after birth is learned also is a fallacy. Learning goes on in the fetus. And if the mother is emotionally stressed, cortisol crosses the placenta, and it will affect the fetus, and it will affect those parts of the brain in the fetus which are maturing at that point in time. So learning goes on prenatally. And at the same time, there is more genetic material in the cerebral cortex at the end of the first year of life than at the beginning of the first year of life. These genes continue to spin out, and these are the genes that are spinning the connections, the synaptic connections between neurons, etc. So again, genetic potential interacts in infinitely complex ways with early experience to construct the neural pathways and connections that quickly become both the foundations and the scaffoldings for all later development. And what I've been talking about here this morning is the foundations of the development, the early roots of the personality. We used to think that the personality was formed about 3-4 years of life. We now realize that the personality formation begins in utero. And I mean even personality characteristics later on, points of life. So everything of the foundations of the personality, the roots, so to speak, the scaffolding for all later development is there. Again, if you alter this badly, the trajectory of the right brain is going to be altered throughout life, and ultimately it will lead to right brain deficits in various disorders. That being the case, UNICEF concluded, it is therefore at this time that the child's well-being, health, and development are most in needs of society's concerns and protection. Notice the way the neuroscience is now being used. Earlier this year, in July, in the journal Science, the two major science journals in the world are Science in the United States and Nature in the UK. So this is Science. The scientists now, coming to a consensus, as I said at the beginning, are now also beginning to look at the political ramifications of these discoveries. So here you see Silver and Singer. These are Canadians, and they speak to the policy goals of the United Nations, and this relates to the UNICEF report, which I just discussed. And they said, investing in child development is the foundation of improved health, economic, and social outcomes. And they're using the word health because it's now clear that these early neurobiological foundations, these early interpersonal neurobiological foundations are also associated not only with psychiatric health and emotional well-being, but also with physical health. Because we're now looking for the origins of medical disorders, the origins of, for example, cardiovascular disease, now being looked for in utero and as also being shaped by the environment. So we're looking at physical diseases because the immune system and its connections into the brain are also being shaped by the attachment relationships. So the foundation for improved health, economic, and social outcomes. Not getting the early years right is linked to violent behavior, and we're now looking at violent behavior and dysregulated aggression becoming common, unfortunately, in the United States. The numbers, as you see, of school shootings, etc., violent behavior. We know that the circuits in the brain that regulate aggression are again in the right hemisphere, and that if these are altered, this is a problematic situation. We also know that abuse and neglect, which would be the poorest earlier beginnings, have a very strong correlation with later predisposition to violence. So violent behavior. Depression, we're looking now at the early origins of depression, deep depressions, etc., also with their roots in the early years. Not getting the early years right, also with higher rates of non-communicable diseases. Again, we all differ in the ability of our immune system to cope with stressors, even bacterial stresses, etc. But also now lower wages, and it negatively affects a nation's gross domestic product. The emphasis on child development would put the focus where it belongs, on the end beneficiary, the child, and her or his potential for development. And what they mean by this is now we should start looking at policies in terms of the best interests of the child. Not the best interest of the father, not the best interest of the mother, not the best interest of the culture, but the best interest of the child. The child literally should be the beneficiary of this, and what optimizes that infant's development, that infant's brain development, that infant's emotional development should be really driving our programs, and again, to put the child at the center. So in science, they refer to the fundamental importance of early child development to overall sustainable development. And they say recent advances in neuroscience indicate the importance of a healthy brain development in the early years to human capital formation. A society only reaps the full benefits of a child's survival if that child becomes a productive individual as an adult. And a productive individual is a child, literally, who has the capacity to evolve into an individual who can contribute both in terms of social development, both in terms of work that is meaningful, but also in the ability, I would suggest, to connect to other human beings. From Freud, in the end, it came out to work and the ability to love, etc., which is what I'm going to talk about soon here. An increase in thriving children over the next 15 years would lay a stronger foundation for healthy, prosperous, and peaceful solutions. And this world could use a big dose of peaceful solutions. So here what they're calling about healthy brain development, this healthy brain development I'm suggesting are the enduring effects of secure attachment, optimal right brain development, and the relational origins of emotional well-being. Okay? Lecture 1.